You tore off a piece of bread this morning without thinking about it. Maybe it was toast. Maybe it was a sandwich, a burger bun, a slice pulled straight from the bag standing at the counter. It's such an ordinary action that you don't even register it as a choice anymore. Your hand just does it, the same way it's done it thousands of times before. But here's the part that should stop you mid-bite. Bread is older than farming. Not about as old as, older. For most of modern history, we've told this story backwards. Humans supposedly settled down first, planted wheat, waited for a harvest, and then, once they had grain sitting around, someone got clever and invented bread as a convenient use for the surplus. Neat, logical, almost completely wrong. The actual evidence says hunter-gatherers were baking something you'd recognize as bread thousands of years before a single human being had ever deliberately planted a crop in the ground. People who owned no land, who followed herds and seasons, who had never seen a farm in their lives, were already kneeling by a fire, grinding wild grain into flour, and turning it into food that has survived, in fragments, for over 14,000 years. And once you understand what it actually took to get there, you will never look at a bread aisle the same way again. This is the real story of how bread was invented, and why it happened in almost the exact opposite order you were taught in school. Reframe. Bread is not the reward of farming. Here's what you think you know. Agriculture happened first. Villages formed. Someone ended up with extra grain lying around. And bread followed naturally, a tidy byproduct of already having wheat to spare. That version places bread near the end of a long line of human progress, a reward handed out once civilization had already arrived. It isn't. Bread sits much closer to the beginning, back when the people making it had no permanent home, no domesticated crops, and almost certainly no idea that farming was even possible yet. To understand how strange that really is, you have to go back to a small stone structure in the Black Desert of eastern Jordan, at a site called Shubaika 1. Enemy 1, there was no wheat field to bake from. Start with the obvious problem. If farming doesn't exist yet, where does the flour even come from? In 2018, a team led by archaeobotanist Amaya Arans Otaegi at the University of Copenhagen published findings from Shubaika 1 that rewrote the entire bread timeline. Buried in the ash of an old stone fireplace, they found charred crumbs, tiny blackened fragments no bigger than a fingernail, that had somehow survived for roughly 14,400 years. Radiocarbon dating placed them squarely in the Natufian period, a culture of hunter-gatherers living in the Levant long before agriculture existed anywhere on Earth. Under a scanning electron microscope, those crumbs showed the exact internal structure of bread: air pockets. A cellular pattern that only forms when ground flour is mixed with water and cooked over heat. This wasn't raw grain sitting in ash by accident. It wasn't porridge that had dried out. It was bread, or close enough to it that the distinction barely matters anymore. Here's where it gets strange, though. The Natufians weren't farming einkorn wheat or barley. They were gathering it wild, along with the starchy tubers of a marsh plant called clubrush, wherever it happened to grow that particular season. No planting, no fields, no ownership of land, no fences, no concept of, this crop is mine. Just people who already knew exactly which wild plants were worth the effort of collecting, grinding, and cooking, and who had worked out an entire process for turning that effort into something you and I would still call food today. That single detail collapses the old timeline completely. Bread wasn't the reward for inventing agriculture. Bread may have been one of the reasons agriculture eventually got invented at all. If wild wheat could already be turned into something this valuable, with this little technology, why wouldn't someone eventually start wondering, what if there was more of it, growing closer to home, every single year, without having to search for it? It's worth sitting with just how deliberate this whole operation already was, long before anyone had a word for recipe. The Shubaika 1 fireplace was a built structure, clearly reused again and again, the kind of feature a group returns to across seasons rather than abandons after one meal. That tells you this wasn't a one-off experiment by one curious forager. It was a known process, passed down and refined, which means bread making was already a piece of cultural knowledge, not a lucky accident that happened once and was never repeated. Enemy 2, turning wild grass into flour, is brutally hard work. But finding wild grain was only step one of the problem. The real challenge nobody talks about is everything that came after. Wild einkorn and wild barley are not cooperative plants. Their seeds are small, tightly wrapped in a tough protective husk, and scattered thinly across a landscape, rather than concentrated conveniently in one patch. Gathering enough of it to matter meant hours of repetitive, low-reward labor, picking through grass stem by stem, under an open sky, with no guarantee the next patch would be any better. And once you finally had the grain, you still had to turn it into flour by hand, using nothing but stone against stone. Archaeologists have recovered ground stone tools at Natufian sites, querns and grinding slabs worn smooth and slightly concave from repeated use. The physical fingerprint of this labor pressed into rock. Bioarchaeological studies examining musculoskeletal stress markers on skeletal remains from this period show consistent, repetitive wear patterns in the arms, shoulders, and lower back. Patterns specifically associated with the motion of kneeling and grinding grain against stone for extended stretches of time. This wasn't an occasional chore. It was a routine so physically demanding it left a permanent signature on the bones of the people who did it, visible to researchers thousands of years later. And there's a second, quieter cost hiding inside every meal. Grinding grain on stone inevitably grinds a small amount of the stone itself into the flour along with it. Dental studies on Neolithic and even earlier populations consistently show heavy tooth wear, and in a significant number of cases, tiny embedded grit fragments in the enamel. A direct physical result of eating bread and porridge made from stone-ground flour, meal after meal, year after year. People were, quite literally, eating their tools one microscopic particle at a time, and their teeth paid the price for it. So here's the real question. If wild grain was this exhausting to gather and this punishing to process, why did anyone keep doing it? Why not just eat the plants raw, or simply lean harder into hunting and gathering easier food? The answer is calories, and the number is bigger than most people expect. A single well-timed harvest of wild cereal, properly gathered and processed, can yield a genuinely substantial amount of usable food energy for the effort involved. Enough to make the grinding and the sore shoulders worth it for a group willing to put in the hours. Bread wasn't an indulgence sitting on the side of the plate. It was one of the most calorie-dense, storable foods available to any hunter-gatherer band on the planet. And that single fact made every blister and every worn-down tooth worth the trade. There's another advantage hiding inside that same trade-off. Unlike meat, unlike fresh greens, dried flatbread keeps. It doesn't spoil in a day. It can be carried to the next hunting ground, saved for a lean week when foraging comes up short. In a world with no refrigeration and no guarantee tomorrow's hunt would succeed, a food that could survive the journey and still be edible days later wasn't a luxury. It was insurance, and that portability may be exactly why bread making spread as fast as it did once one group figured it out. Enemy 3. Making it rise was an accident nobody planned. Here's the part nobody talks about. Early bread almost certainly wasn't fluffy. It was flat, dense, closer to a modern flatbread than anything resembling a soft sandwich loaf. Getting from that flat, heavy disk to the light, airy, risen bread most of us eat today required something the earliest bakers never set out to invent. Wild yeast is everywhere. Quietly, invisibly. It lives on grain husks, drifts in the air, settles onto anything left uncovered long enough. If a simple mixture of flour and water sits out for a while before cooking, wild yeast and naturally occurring lactobacilli bacteria begin feeding on the starches, releasing carbon dioxide and mild acids as a byproduct of their own survival. Leave that mixture long enough, and the dough starts to bubble, rise, and develop a distinct sour tang nobody asked for. Nobody planned that moment. It happened because a batch of dough was left sitting around, probably out of simple necessity, maybe because there wasn't time to cook it right away, maybe because it was simply forgotten near the fire overnight. And whoever first noticed that this spoiled dough baked into something lighter, more flavorful, and easier to digest than the flat version had just stumbled onto sourdough fermentation, one of the oldest biotechnologies humans have ever used, discovered completely by accident, thousands of years before anyone understood what yeast even was, let alone that it was a living organism at all. Nobody would actually understand what was happening inside that bowl for thousands of years afterward. Bakers passed the trick down as tradition, as instinct, as this is just how you make the good bread, without any concept of microorganisms at all. It wasn't until the 19th century that the French chemist Louis Pasteur, working on an entirely different set of questions about fermentation in wine and beer, finally proved that yeast was a living organism, a single-celled fungus consuming sugar and releasing gas and alcohol as it did. For roughly 14,000 years, humanity used a living creature as a tool every single day, fed it, kept it alive, relied on it completely, without knowing it existed. Bread wasn't just early biotechnology. It may be the single longest-running instance of humans domesticating an organism they couldn't even see. This single accident collides directly with a much bigger, still unresolved question in archaeology. Which came first, bread or beer? For decades, some researchers, following an idea proposed by archaeologist Robert Braidwood back in the 1950s, argued that beer may have actually come first, that early interest in cultivating cereal grains was driven as much by a desire to brew fermented drinks as it was by a desire to bake bread, since both processes rely on the exact same wild grains and the exact same wild yeasts working in almost identical ways. Other researchers push back hard against this idea, pointing out that solid, storable, transportable bread would have been the far more urgent survival priority for a hunter-gatherer group, with beer more likely developing afterward, or alongside it, rather than driving the whole process from the start. This debate has genuinely never been fully settled, and honestly, it's more interesting left that way. Bread and beer may not even have separate origin stories. They may simply be two branches of the exact same accidental discovery, fermentation, splitting off from one single moment of forgotten dough sitting too close to a fire. The turning point, when bread started shaping people, not the other way around. For thousands of years after Shubaika I, bread stayed a wild grain product, made by hunter-gatherers who still had no fields of their own, no ownership, no long-term plan beyond the next harvest they happened to stumble across. Then, starting around 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, at sites like Abu Huraira in modern-day Syria, something fundamental shifted. People began deliberately planting einkorn and emmer wheat instead of only gathering it wild, season after season, in the same patch of ground. Here's the twist worth sitting with for a second. Genetic and archaeobotanical research on domesticated wheat shows it developed a specific, permanent mutation, a tougher stem that no longer shatters and scatters its seeds naturally the way wild wheat does. Wild wheat needs to shatter apart to reproduce and spread. Domesticated wheat physically cannot reproduce anymore without a human hand deliberately harvesting it and replanting the seeds by hand. In other words, bread wheat became fully dependent on us at almost the exact same moment we became fully dependent on it. That's not a metaphor. That is a biological arrangement both species walked into together, and neither one has been able to walk back out of since that moment. Once wheat was under deliberate cultivation, everything scaled upward at once. Surplus grain meant surplus flour, meant surplus bread, meant something entirely new was now possible. Bread as currency, bread as status, bread as religion. Nowhere is that clearer than in ancient Egypt. Excavations led by archaeologist Mark Lehner near the workers' village at the Giza Pyramid Complex uncovered enormous communal bakeries, some capable of producing bread on an almost industrial scale, alongside strong evidence that the laborers who physically built the pyramids were paid largely in bread and beer as their standard, expected wages. Bread wasn't a side dish in this world. It was payroll. Egyptian tomb paintings depict dozens of distinct bread shapes and varieties, and Egyptian bakers are widely credited with popularizing sourdough leavening at scale, likely by deliberately keeping a portion of fermented dough from one batch to start the next, a technique that, remarkably, is still exactly how sourdough starters are maintained today. A baker in Cairo 4,500 years ago and a home baker feeding a sourdough starter in their kitchen this week are, quite literally, running the same living biological process, just separated by a few hundred human generations. And Egypt wasn't alone in turning bread into an institution. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets from Sumerian and later Babylonian temple archives record grain rations distributed to workers in standardized units, alongside recipes and records for dozens of named bread varieties baked specifically for temple offerings. Bread here wasn't just food, It was bureaucracy. It was tracked, rationed, taxed, and offered to gods, sometimes all in the same clay tablet. Centuries later, in ancient Rome, the state itself took over large-scale bread distribution through the cura annonae, a grain and bread dole handed out to the urban population, later immortalized in the phrase bread and circuses, a description of how a state could keep a restless population calm using nothing more than a full stomach and a good show. By this point, bread had traveled an enormous distance from a handful of charred crumbs in a desert fireplace. It had become a tool of empire. Bread didn't just feed empires either. It started showing up in their spiritual lives too, and it never really left. Unleavened flatbread became matzah, central to the Jewish story of the Exodus, eaten specifically because there was no time to let dough rise while fleeing captivity. Centuries later, in Christian tradition, bread was placed at the exact center of the faith's most important ritual, the Eucharist, a piece of bread standing in for something far larger than flour and water. Across the wider Islamic world, khubz and naan became inseparable from the shared table, torn by hand and used to scoop food rather than cut with a knife, turning a meal into something communal rather than something eaten alone. Three enormous, entirely separate religious traditions, each independently deciding that of everything on the table, bread was the one thing sacred enough to represent the divine. That's not a coincidence of taste. That's a signal of just how deeply bread had embedded itself into what it even meant to be human by that point in history. Bread's grip on power didn't end with empires either. Centuries later, in medieval Europe, English law under kings like Henry III introduced formal regulations called the Assize of Bread and Ale, strict rules dictating exactly how much a loaf should weigh and cost, with real punishments for bakers caught cheating the standard. Bread was considered too important to leave to the free market alone. And out of that same medieval world came a small linguistic fossil most people still repeat today without knowing where it came from. In wealthier households, the finest, whitest part of a loaf, the upper crust, was reserved for the most important people at the table, while servants and lower-status guests were handed the coarser bottom portion. That's where the phrase upper crust, still used today to describe the wealthy elite, actually comes from. A piece of slang sitting in ordinary conversation right now, with roots running straight back to who got the good part of the bread and who didn't. Bread meets the machine. Jump forward from medieval bakehouses to the early 20th century, and bread goes through one final transformation, arguably as strange, in its own way, as anything that happened at Shubeka I. For roughly 14,000 years, someone had to cut bread with a knife, at home, by hand, loaf by loaf. Then, in 1928, an American inventor named Otto Rohwedder introduced the first commercially viable bread slicing machine, and the loaf changed forever. The machine didn't just slice the bread, it slowed the staling process by wrapping the sliced loaf immediately, solving a problem that had made earlier slicing attempts commercially useless. The idea caught on so completely, so fast, that within just a few years an entire piece of American slang was born around it. The greatest thing since sliced bread. A phrase people still use today for almost any minor convenience, most of them with no idea it's a direct reference to a specific machine invented less than 100 years ago. Industrial baking scaled even further from there. Mechanized mixing, continuous ovens, and commercial yeast strains, isolated and cultivated by scientists rather than kept alive by tradition in a clay jar, made bread cheaper and more uniform than it had ever been in 14,000 years of history. And then, almost immediately, that same uniformity became a liability during wartime. In Britain during the Second World War, government restrictions led to the creation of the national loaf, a dense, gray, whole-grain bread mandated to stretch limited wheat supplies as far as they could possibly go. People complained about it constantly, joked about its color and its texture, and ate it anyway, because a nutritionally dense loaf that used every part of the grain was exactly what a rationed, blockaded nation needed most. Once again, thousands of years after Shubeka I, bread was doing the same fundamental job it had always done, turning a scarce, difficult resource into the maximum possible amount of usable survival energy for the people who needed it. What it built. Step back, and the whole shape of the story finally comes into focus. Bread didn't wait patiently for agriculture to be invented so that it could exist. Bread may have helped push agriculture into existence in the first place, by proving, Thousands of years earlier, at a hunter-gatherer campfire in the Jordanian desert, that wild grain was worth every hour of brutal, back-breaking labor it demanded from the people processing it. That demand shaped human bodies, worn joints, ground-down teeth, sore shoulders passed down through generations of the same repetitive motion. And it shaped human behavior too. Cooperation clustered around shared grinding stones, patience with slowly fermenting dough nobody fully understood, the gradual, irreversible domestication of a plant that could no longer survive on its own without us standing over it every single season. Every later chapter, granaries, temple bakeries, bread as wages, bread as religious offering, bread as the single most eaten food on the entire planet today, traces back through an unbroken chain to a handful of charred crumbs in a fireplace that nobody was ever supposed to find 14,000 years later. Look at how far that single accidental discovery ended up traveling. From a stone fireplace in the desert, to a temple ledger in Babylon, to a pyramid worker's daily wage, to a phrase about upper-crust wealth still used at dinner parties today, to a slicing machine in an American factory, to a gray wartime loaf keeping an entire nation fed under siege. Almost nothing else humans eat can trace a single unbroken thread that long, through that many completely different civilizations, all still recognizably doing the exact same thing to the exact same handful of grain. And now look at what's sitting on your counter, or in your kitchen, or in the bag on your table right now. A soft, mass-produced loaf that took someone at a factory maybe an hour start to finish to make, using machines that measure, mix, and bake with a precision the Natufians could never have imagined. They didn't have a field, a mill, or an oven in any modern sense. They had a fire, a stone, and the sheer patience required to grind wild grass into something worth eating, one exhausting handful at a time. You didn't invent your relationship with bread. You inherited it from people who never once thought of themselves as farmers, who were simply solving a hunger problem one aching, deliberate handful of wild grain at a time, with no idea that 14,000 years later, someone would find the ashes of their fire and know exactly what they'd been doing there. You don't think about where bread actually comes from anymore. Not really. You think about whether to get sourdough or whole wheat, whether the bakery down the street is still open, what to put on it for lunch today. And that's not because the struggle behind it disappeared. It's because 14,000 years ago, someone knelt by a fire in the desert, ground grain that didn't belong to anyone, and quietly decided the ache in their arms was worth it. If you want more stories like this, the ones buried in ash and stone that quietly explain what's sitting on your plate right now, stick around. There's a lot more.